Three, two, one. Welcome to This Week in Higher Ed. Mike Palmer here, joined as always by Dr. Terri Givens. Terri, how you doing today?
I am very good today.
And we have a return engagement. We're very excited to have Jonathan Friedman with us, who's from Penn America. Jonathan, welcome back to the show.
Nice to be here. Hi, Mike. Hi, Terri.
Yeah, and there's a lot going on, a lot for us to talk about. And maybe just at the very top, Jonathan, can you remind folks what Penn America is, what you're doing, just so that they understand what's going to be the main focus of today's conversation?
Absolutely. At Penn America, I direct our efforts on free expression and education with a significant focus on higher education and free speech and diversity inclusion on campuses. We've been very active this week, and in particular today, in starting to help push back against state legislation around the U.S. that is impinging on the freedom of expression for teachers and students in schools and colleges. And we've been also rolling out a set of new workshops and training programs for faculty and for students to encourage and improve upon their free speech literacy in educational context. So that's some of the stuff that I thought we could talk about today.
Absolutely. Looking forward to all that. And Terri, we always like to kick it off with what's capturing our imagination, our attention these days. Anything new and exciting? Where are you at these days? What's going on in your world?
Well, first of all, big news in California. We are opening up today, so people are able to get rid of masks, although I'm still wearing masks in indoor spaces just to be, I think a lot of people are feeling like, especially indoor spaces where there's, people working, it's a good idea to continue to wear a mask, and I will do that. I'm also heading off to Montreal in a couple of weeks to start my new gig at McGill University. And actually it's really interesting because what's very relevant is we had a conference on academic freedom just a week ago, I believe, and it was very well attended, lots of interest up in Canada about this topic. And so I think this is going to be a really rich discussion today.
Yeah, that's exciting. And I think we're going to get more cosmopolitan by virtue of your move to Montreal. We'll probably maybe bring in a little more French, French language and great cuisine. Great culture up there. Lots of stuff like that. And then here in Brooklyn, it's kind of similar. I think there's a lot of folks who are still wearing masks. Interesting thing that I've been tracking is there's some research out there saying, like, if we continued with some of the indoor masking practices, we might be able to eliminate the flu, which, like, we had a record low flu season because of our practices that were limiting the spread of COVID. And it is interesting that some of these practices are actually better for limiting the transmission of disease. But it's just so strange how it's become a political statement and a place where, you have to land on a team in terms of your masking practices, which I think very much does tie to a lot of what we're probably going to be talking about today with you, Jonathan. And then where are you based in this great, big, beautiful world of ours, Jonathan, and what's going on in your neck of the woods?
Well, I'm here in New York with you, Mike, and we are, the city is celebrating reopening. We had a fireworks show here in New York as Governor Cuomo has proclaimed that I don't know if the pandemic is yet officially over, but everywhere except in hospitals and schools and the subway of New York City, it seems to be. And it's an exciting time to see the city really breathing, having life breathed into it again. The people of New York being out in public is such a key feature of the experience of New York, and it has been a ghost town in aspects of it for over a year now. And so people are reuniting. It feels like there's a song that was written by Louis Armstrong that keeps playing in my head. What a wonderful world. I see these people greeting one another, and I feel like everybody are on the street right now. That's what is in the air. The song was written about Queens originally, so it was inspired by Queens. So it is a fitting song to kind of have in our backgrounds as we reopen.
I'm ready for some Satchmo as our underscore for the rest of, maybe he'll just be our spiritual inspiration for the rest of the conversation. Yeah, you know, and interestingly in New York, because it does remind me a little bit of Montreal as well, is like it's become much more of a outdoor socialization spaces are emerging in new ways. Like all restaurants all have outdoor seating. That's not going to be rolled back. And it does feel like in some ways there's more of a European cosmopolitan kind of vibe to how we're socializing. And to your point, Terry, like I don't feel as comfortable in indoor spaces with other people as I did before, and I don't imagine that that's going to change. I feel very comfortable in aggregate settings that are outside, but I think just how we think about space has changed in some interesting ways. And I thought that might be an interesting place to pick up with you, Jonathan, as well. Is I've heard more lately about incidents. You know, I saw an article recently about air rage, where people on planes are getting into it with each other more now that we are starting to get back into these aggregate settings, congregations in not the most spiritual way. I think we're actually being around others and are forced to engage with them in new ways. I know you've been tracking this from the context of free expression, and that's definitely something that we're going to want to talk about in terms of campus life. But have you been at Penn America, or just generally in your world, are there ways to track like how on edge and how contentious things are? And, you know, is that a trend that you're starting to see, that you've seen increasing, or do you have any read on how well folks are getting along and how much we're encountering more conflict and dissent, whether in higher ed or elsewhere?
Man, this is such an interesting question, and you're posing it to someone who's thought a lot about the sociology and politics of how we think about this. I'd be curious to hear Terri's answer as well. But you know, I don't think we have a tracker for it, but certainly my observation of this is that the rage is kind of has to go somewhere, and it's just moving around. And in many ways, I think some of the anger that was fomented around the Tea Party era actually has really just kind of bounced around and found new targets. So it was, you know, against, I don't know, whether it was against Obama and Obamacare, whether it was against campuses, and the sense that that campuses have become, you know, inhospitable to free speech. And in that kind of anger, is now we're seeing it arise in school board meetings and school districts and PTAs. And I think that is really opening up as the new frontier, where, I mean, obviously the effects of the pandemic on parents have been significant. You know, you can't think of a time in recent history where so much responsibility was placed on parents and such high expectations of them. I read some study that we have fewer women, all the mothers who essentially left the workplace during the pandemic, and you know, maybe that is playing some role. But now we have viral images of school districts, school board meetings where they have to take recesses because everyone is shouting at each other so much about perceptions of what is being taught or not taught with regard to racism and history and culture and, you know, the meaning of America. And the battle is pitched. The people are digging in, and as you said, you know, staking their claim on one side or the other. And I think that sense of you know, conflict and rage, let's say, I don't think that's going to dissipate over the summer.
Yeah. And Terri, perspective from your neck of the woods on this?
Right. Well, in terms of increasing kind of tension, I mean, a lot of this is, I think we're going to see this happening increasingly as we kind of come out of the quarantine and the COVID and all of that. Part of it is just, I think Jonathan's right about this in terms of just pent up frustration and you know, as we start to interact with each other, I think there's a lot of you know, tension around, you know, I think there's a lot of confusion still about what we should be doing, right? And there's just been so much that's been going on politically. You know, I know, you know, a friend of ours, Cynthia Miller Idris, is kind of following what's going on in terms of hate groups and hate crimes. And, you know, if you're interested in this stuff, one of the places that tracks this closely is the Southern Poverty Law Center. not necessarily kind of just the stuff that's happening on airplanes, more of the hate crimes and so on. But I do think we're actually, though, I think I have seen data that shows that hate crimes are increasing. Well, certainly with, we see what's happening with Asian American Pacific Islanders. That's definitely on the increase. And so I think a lot of this is in many ways connected to what's going on with this transition from COVID. And, the reality is with the variants coming out, I think that's, a big concern, that the unvaccinated are going to be impacted and so on. So, there's just a lot floating out there. And of course, as social scientists, we tend to need, we have to collect the data before we can give you any trends. And, but, I'm sure, Southern Poverty Law Center, 538.com, organizations like that are probably doing a lot more tracking of these different trends.
Yeah. And then at the same time, the other dimension that I know you've talked about, Jonathan, that is interesting is the role of social media and new ways in which we get our information, where there is the term like filter bubbles, which is one that I've been thinking about more, where, when we're all secluded in our homes and generally getting our information from limited resources and, echo chambers who tend to think the same way, I think that does tend to increase some of the polarization and some of the thinking that this is the only way to think. And when you're exposed to difference, it immediately becomes almost tribal in terms of us versus them, and one's going to win, one's going to lose. I know that's also part of what your course, I think, is going to be designed to help educators and folks in higher education understand how to help facilitate more healthy discourse and ways to resolve and address some of the conflicts that are out there today. But any perspective on the role of our media diets and how that has changed in recent years, and then probably was exacerbated by the pandemic to some extent?
Oh, I mean, it's extreme. We thought it was bad a year and a half ago. Remember that? And we thought it was, and we placed a lot of, I think, blame, maybe probably rightly so, on President Trump. But it's clear that that sense of daily outrage, a daily diet of outrage, is very palpable. And you almost see somebody's name now, a name of a famous person in the news, and you're immediately wondering, well, what did they do, or what did they say, or and then you're asking yourself, should I be angry about this? I don't know. And then you have to kind of decide how much time you're going to spend educating yourself on the latest outrage and how you're going to decide to feel about it. And it's very difficult to do that independent of, the noise and the opinions and the echo chambers that are telling you to feel one way or another about it. But I will say that the polarization that we're experiencing, the social media, the echo chambers, all of it has put, I do think, unprecedented pressure on institutions and spaces where we think people can still get together. Public libraries, public schools, public universities, publishing houses, the notion of the internet itself as a place for discussion and debate in a somewhat neutral way, all of those places, spaces of interaction that once upon a time, their task of being kind of open seemed, I think, easier than it does right now. And there's a host of reasons for why that is, including the sense that those who are deliberately trafficking in falsehoods have, started to do that with greater swagger and greater confidence and greater reach. And, then the rest of us have to live with those consequences. I mean, there's no question that all of us right now are subject to some piece of disinformation once a day. And, if you really were to search over your own social media, or, if you had an archive of all your conversations with people, you'd be surprised that something you told somebody the last, 3 months isn't true or isn't the whole story. And there's no question that is affecting all of us. And that is, to turn for a second to this course that we're going to offer with Brighter Higher Ed in Penn America this July, that is really the impetus for it, is to help people who are on the front lines of working in those institutions and spaces where we do hope and expect that they might still somehow be able to be open to a diversity of, disagreeing and sometimes contentious views. And, we've talked a lot in the pandemic about frontline workers in a health sense, but when we think about frontline workers in a democracy sense, actually those are professors and teachers, and librarians, and they're the burden of trying to manage this moment is high. It's significant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Terri, I know you've talked many times about how there's a shortage of resources for educators to just know how to teach, to know how to advance into management or administration. And that's something that's been very important to Brighter Higher Ed and to you. What's your perspective on educating people in these spaces, in facilitating free expression and understanding how to do it in a measured and fair and equitable way?
Well, Jonathan said it, faculty are on the front lines, and, in particular in, the kinds of courses where, you're going to be discussing contentious issues. I'm a political scientist, so I know what this is, how this works. And, the issues, we don't, think about graduate school, we don't teach future faculty necessarily. I think there's some institutions that do, but it's not like built into our curriculum that we teach graduate students, what is academic freedom and what does it mean to, especially, we don't teach faculty to teach for the most part, let alone how to manage these issues in the classroom. And so what happens is, we have these workshops maybe that happen, or think about faculty orientation. I'm going to be going through that as a new faculty member at an institution. How much am I going to, you don't really have a lot of time in those situations to teach faculty about the complexities of academic freedom and freedom of expression, let alone, diversity, equity, and inclusion, so these are things I think that what we're going to see happening are going to have to be built into, kind of ongoing training and discussions and so on at institutions, because it's becoming more and more critical as we, figure out, diversity of thought is important. I always try to create a classroom space where students from all sides of the political spectrum feel like they can express their perspectives and views without fear or without worrying about being shouted down or things like that, and that, and so I think it's really important that we come at it from a factually based and evidence-based, but basically creating a classroom space that is open to students, but understanding that there are limits to what they can say in the classroom. So that's a really tough thing to manage and to find the right balance.
Yeah, and then Jonathan, I believe today, this just in, PEN America and many others have come out with a statement talking about how to really combat some of the chilling effect that is out there now around the critical race theory, and Nicole Hannah-Jones got a lot of notoriety around not getting tenure at University of North Carolina because of the 1619 project, among other things. That's become a very heated focal point in the national discourse. Can you catch us up a little more on what PEN America has been doing and how you're trying to come at this problem?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I think, suddenly everyone in the country seems to be talking about critical race theory. And then when you ask a great number of people, what is critical race theory? They have no definition of it. And so we have to start from the premise that, I want to be clear, there is a national conversation taking place about something with 98% of the people talking not really knowing what they're talking about. And maybe that is typical of a country, in the wake of the last president, typical of a media ecosystem that is more oriented toward ginning up outrage than it is to informing people of facts and truths. But you can't really understand the mania around critical race theory right now without understanding the mania around campuses from the past 2 years. I mean, it really is one and the same. It is a effort that began with trying to spread falsehoods about the state of universities and university education, and what a campus life is like for free speech. I think some of what the criticisms that were aired in the past few years were true, were reasonable. I think some of them were, a great number of them were exaggerated. And now I think that maybe it's because the pandemic, shut down enough campuses that that energy went somewhere new. But now that energy, again, is going to secondary schools and below. Occasionally, I think there are stories that have made national news of people who lead schools or who are conducting quote unquote diversity trainings that might be doing things that are questionable. But the reaction to this has been tenfold in that we've seen a wave of state level bills introduced based on President Trump's executive order from last year about, quote unquote, race and sex stereotyping. That is essentially, very strange legislation. And I cannot stress this enough. There's this, everyone's talking about how bad is this legislation? What does it really say? What does it really do? Nobody knows. Nobody understands it. It's deliberately and purposefully very convoluted in how it's all been written. Different states have taken this set of constructs around what are quote unquote divisive concepts, and they've put other language around it to make bills that have widely different meanings. Some are about state institutions, some target schools, some target universities and schools, some proclaim to target private schools or even private colleges and universities. And that's quite surprising from just given the history of how private schools have been regulated. But this is the kind of extreme moment we're in, where suddenly this legislation started in a few places and now it's spreading like wildfire. I mean, over 20 states have introduced bills, and politicians are freely discussing their efforts to ban critical race theory. You have governors saying, I can't wait to ban it, and it's so bad. But then all the legislation doesn't actually ban critical race theory explicitly. It has all this other language dressed up as though it is trying to purge schools of racism and sexism, and then to oppose them, it becomes very difficult. And so it's quite there is a really real diversity of what has been done under this banner. Now, given how bad this legislation is, given how quickly it's spread, and given the absence of a clear and strong unified response, we began speaking to a number of academic and educational groups in the past few weeks about, what could we start to do to speak out against them and to raise public awareness of just how troubling a lot of them are. And so the result was a letter that we published today, primarily in conjunction with the American Historical Association, the American Association of University Professors, and the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And so it's a lot of associations with a lot of acronyms. But then we appealed, each of us, to our networks of other academic and educational organizations, and 76 other groups signed on. Actually, now we're up to, I think, closer to 80. We've had a few more actors join today, organizations join us today. And so it's clear that many informed individuals and associations and groups are looking at this legislation and quite concerned, because this is the most widespread and coordinated effort to censor and stifle ideas and speech in educational institutions in recent memory. And it goes far beyond any effort we saw deliberately done on any campuses by people in authority to silence speech. It's just beyond anything else we've seen.
Yeah, and I do want to get back to the flip side of this too, where historically a lot of free speech conversations have centered around extremists on the right who have provoked a lot of response, and folks who are very strident about the First Amendment have been placed in a difficult position of defending groups like, famously the Nazis marching in Skokie. Like that's been a long-standing history for groups like PEN America, and it's challenging. It's particularly challenging in this day and age, I think, to foster both sides, to actually protect the rights of those who are saying things that you actually disagree with, which I'd like to come back to that. But before we get there, I do see a question here from D. Van. How can educators embed critical race theory and anti-racism into their teaching practice or curriculum? Terri, do you want to get that one? Because I know that's something you spent a lot of time thinking about.
Well, first of all, we need to define critical race theory. It's not something you teach. It's not something that you would embed in a class or teaching practice. It's something that we use as social scientists, as legal scholars use to frame their research. It's really not designed to be incorporated into teaching. On the other hand, anti-racism is something that can be incorporated into teaching practice and curriculum, but it's a very complicated issue. So I'm going to do it very differently in political science than somebody in a math class is going to do. And it's more about the way that we approach our students and the way that we basically, my number one thing, that I tell people is be intentional. Make sure you aren't being biased against, particular types of students in your classroom. Mm-hmm. And so, I think what's really important is that faculty I'm a proponent for training, right? I mean, I do think professional development is important on this front, and we've done work on this with some universities as well as corporations in terms of helping them understand it, and of course I'm going to talk about radical empathy because that book is really designed, my book is designed to help people not just educators, but anybody, how to be anti-racist. There's lots of books out there that talk about this, but really it's about making sure you understand your own biases first. Mm-hmm. And then you can turn around and say, okay, I know that it's acknowledgement of our own, it's being vulnerable and saying, yes, I know I live in a world that has, where structural race, and the only place where CRT touches on this is this idea of structural racism. Mm-hmm. And so I don't even talk about CRT in my book on radical empathy, but I do talk about it in my next book, which is The Roots of Racism, because CRT helps us to frame the discussion. It is not, something that, oh, here I'm going to teach CRT. No, I'm going to use CRT to frame, my research and potentially my teaching if it makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. And if I'm talking about, the fact that structural racism exists and how we can talk about it. So in any case, I really believe that it's important for us as faculty to start with our own biases and then to see how that plays into the way that we interact with people, and how we also, are practicing empathy. How, imagine if, faculty could sit there and say, okay, I'm going to try to understand the perspectives of all my students. Now it's hard to do in a big class, but, more generally, that's the kind of approach I think that is more useful.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of, alignment with the way that I think about some of these issues in college classrooms in terms of, if somebody says that something that another student said has harmed them, there's a way to react to and manage the situation that is neither dismissive of those concerns, nor allows them to override the classroom debate so that it shuts down conversation and nothing more can be said. And I think this is very important for faculty to understand, because though the current political alignment of these issues is one way, it's not hard for it to imagine the other. So for example, when I say a student says they were harmed, most people are imagining, I think the first case that people think of is, oh, it's a student of color saying that there's a white student said something that offends them, and therefore it shuts down conversation. But it is equally plausible. You could have a conservative student in class saying that they object to the way that President Trump's record is being represented, or you could have a student who grew up in China in class who objects to the way that Chinese history is being discussed if they learned in a school system where that narratives of that history were not based on, not subscribing to the same facts that we use in American schools or in American universities, certainly. And so there are a range of ways that we must be alert to maintaining a space in classrooms for discussion and for empathy. And it's really just about, balancing these. And on the critical race theory point, I'll just say, it's a theory, it's multiple theories. It's not an agreed upon, it's not a single, it's the singularity of it really does injustice to what is actually, as far as I know, a dynamic field with disagreements about different, like sociology. It's like saying, how do I embed, I don't know, political science into my class? It's never been as large a field of study as what we think of as others, but certainly there are internal disagreements in that body of work, but also that are much more more appropriately engaged with, in law schools and by academics and intellectuals. I don't think it's a theory for how people, get along in society.
Yeah, it does make me think also about the concept of psychological safety and building trust, so that, Terri, you've talked a lot about the importance of being vulnerable, and also modeling what it means to be present and aware of your feelings and aware of how you're teaching through your example. I'd like to get a little more into that really with each of you around almost like the social emotional component of being a great educator, facilitating these types of conversations in this very contentious time, because it feels like you need to be very self-aware, but then also in some ways couch your own perspective in the same way that you will respond to others, rather than feeling as though you need to establish the right way to think. And instead you're almost modeling the right way to engage with difference and to engage with like heightened emotion. I don't know if either of you have any perspective on that. It's something I've been reflecting a lot on lately.
Yeah, I would say that my approach is to be honest and transparent as much as I can with people I work with, as well as my students. And so when I go into that classroom, I'm going to, in September, I'm going to do a check-in, and I'm going to be honest about how I'm feeling about these transitions, and I'm going to be teaching remotely still. So but I know some of the students will be going face to face again, and I think it's important to upfront address the fact that we're all under stress, and this is a difficult time, and we've all been touched by COVID in different ways, and but that we have this really great learning opportunity, and to grow from this, and that I'm going to do my best to be sensitive to their needs, but also my own, because it's not like I'm not touched by this as well. And I think that's the kind of approach that can really help students understand that they aren't in this alone. We're in this together.
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of also adjusting and calibrating our expectation of incoming students and what they're coming in with. And of course, some of this is learning lag affected by the pandemic, but even before it, most faculty coming in to teach a group of students don't enter the room with the expectation that their students are being exposed to and influenced by falsehoods every day. How does that change how we enter that conversation? How does that change how we set the stage for academic conversation, for citing sources and facts to reputable sources? I think that we, many of us academics who have published and kind of moved up in the ranks at a certain point in time, we take a lot of that for granted. And the reality is, not only do we have to recalibrate our expectations of what students are arriving with, we also need to expect that they don't know the first thing about what it means to have a truly free and open debate. Few high schools truly allow that. In fact, high schools are often sites where there can be much greater policing of what people say, and there are huge imbalances in what people understand about the First Amendment, free speech, academic freedom, human rights, the university and academia as an enterprise. And it's our job as faculty to set the tone for this. And I think the thing is that that's not really well done in orientations. And so if you're not doing that at the start of your class, well, by class number 3 or number 4, you're going to see the ways in which the lack of setting tone, the lack of being clear about expectations have impacted it. And And I'll say also it's an equity issue. We also, part of why we have assumptions about our incoming students is because we're used to teaching a whole bunch of students who we think come equally prepared to succeed in our classes. And so we haven't really been having this conversation nationally about free speech in conjunction with the conversation about equity and student success and the need for kind of leveling the playing field. But it's essential that we start to.
Yeah.
And actually, I want to jump in here because, Jonathan, I teach a class where I have to assume that students come in with misinformation, immigration politics. It's such a contentious issue that I immediately assume, and one of the reasons is I wrote a textbook is to put the facts out there.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also add there's another layer to this. There's intersectionality in terms of gender and race and religion even. So there's a lot of factors that are influencing faculties in different ways, and I think it's important to acknowledge that women, people of color, people from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, faculty and students come into this space with issues that they have to confront and deal with. And I think that's another thing that I say it's important, along with trying to set up a framework for civil discussion and so on. It's important to acknowledge, look, we all come from different cultural backgrounds, ethnicity, race, etc. And it's important to honor each other's cultures and perspectives in a way that is supportive, and but also to we want things to be fact-based and evidence-based. So
yeah. And then I guess maybe playing the role of devil's advocate, or at least understanding some of the themes that are out there, because I imagine part of what you have to do these types, to facilitate these conversations well, is to understand the more difficult conversations you might have. There is a thread out there nowadays around the notion of white privilege and the idea that white people are feeling under siege, they're feeling attacked, and there's a reaction that you see frequently, which is, I haven't done any of this. Why am I being attacked? And there's this concept of white fragility that's also out there. There's a lot of these notions that are emerging around how white people are part of the problem. And in that same context, we're trying to make everyone feel included and comfortable voicing their opinions. How do you navigate that? How do you allow for that to be part of the conversation while still understanding when things cross a line, potentially become hateful, or potentially lack the critical thinking that really is, I think, at the foundation of all of this? Critical race theory has critical in it. So in some ways, higher education is helping people develop their critical thought. But any perspective on how to maybe empathize with that that sense of being attacked that we are hearing, particularly on the right? There's a lot of this conversation emerging. I'd really love to hear from both of you on how do you incorporate that into the conversation without necessarily losing the thread.
To me, the potential to really improve the climate for disagreement and the range of feelings that you're talking about, people having the range of criticisms that are being leveled, the range of feelings that everyone is having right now about all of these discourses, really is free speech. And I think we have I think there are groups on the left today who have little historical connection of the ways in which free speech, until extremely recently, was a very strong radical progressive left idea. They've only experienced it being championed by the right. Jim Jordan this week announced he's going to start a campus free speech caucus. You can imagine that the progressive elements of Congress don't really want to be on that caucus with him, right? But I think it's very important that we try to reset and bring everyone back to the table around common understandings of the rules of engagement. And that's what free speech is about. And so free speech gives us, yes, the power to say things that are harmful to other people, but it absolutely allows for the radical critique of, white privilege and some of the more powerful, sharpened feelings and ideas that are finally after a long time being given voice to and being taken seriously, right? We really being heard by people. And so, of course, when a significant critique of society is being aired, until very recently, it was largely dismissed. Now people are taking it seriously. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, that means it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And so I think that at the same time, that I think that kind of a common basis in free speech can allow for greater tolerance of these divergent views and greater reckoning with these feelings around a lot of this. I was in a conversation recently where someone who was talking a great deal about liberalism, the importance of liberalism to the university, the way in which it might be dying in universities, said that it was very important that we maintain a liberal order in college campuses, and that should include teaching a wide variety of ideas and not critical race theory. And that's what they said. And you're able to kind of see there, you're saying, well, hold on a minute. How are you committed to liberalism and free speech, but you have some exception you're trying to create for some set of ideas that you are making a preconceived judgment don't deserve space? And when you kind of can bring that to someone's attention and highlight those contradictions, that's where you can start to change their minds. On the other side, I was in another conversation recently where someone who is white, of European descent, was talking about their feelings that of being censored in society and being hyper careful about how they speak about a lot of issues. And someone of an African American in the room said, I hear what you're saying, but that's the way me and everyone I know has felt our whole lives.
Yeah.
And you could drop a pin in that moment, and you could, and free speech has to allow for both of those feelings to be worked out, to be said, to be shared, to be heard. And that's why it's so essential that it is really the underpinning of academic discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I pretty much agree with what Jonathan has said. I don't think I can add much more except just to say that, I think the broader issue is that faculty can't ignore this stuff anymore.
Yeah, right.
And I think, there's the sense amongst faculty, I have so many burdens, I have, my service and my teaching and my research, and, I just want to focus on that. And it's like, no, this impacts every aspect, it impacts our service and our teaching and our research. So
yeah.
The more educated we can become on these issues, the better off we're going to be going forward, because we just can't sit back and wait for these things to happen. We have to be, and I can guarantee you there are going to be students in classes this fall who are going to be challenging faculty on what they're teaching and how they're teaching it, and they need to have, and it's up to faculty and their leadership to take on the responsibility to say, yes, we are going to help you in this process,
right.
And not leave faculty out there on their own. And this is something I'm really advocating, is that leadership really step up and say, we need to help our faculty on this front.
Yeah. And another trend related, I think, that we've talked about in this conversation, it's been emerging in a number of fronts, is the idea of being trauma informed and understanding how to, one of the themes that I saw in the course that you're offering is the ability to de-escalate conflicts. I'd love to understand how we could train people, what techniques work well to gauge when you want to encourage more speech and maybe allow for these conflicts to rise up, and then when it makes sense to turn the thermostat down a little bit and intervene as the person who's really responsible for this conversation to sort of protect the rules of engagement and the sensitive feelings that everyone will have when the conversation becomes a little more heated.
Well, I would just want to say, my response to this question is informed by conversations I've had with a lot of people about this. And so I don't want to say that I have all the answers or that there are always easy answers. In fact, I think numerous situations, it's inevitable that you're going to find the situation that requires judgment, and you're going to have to find a way to be comfortable with that judgment. But so our work in this program this summer and our work at Penn over recent years has benefited tremendously from being open to conversation with people across the political spectrum in different kinds of roles in higher education, in diversity offices, in deanships, in department chairs, really trying to say like, okay, well, how would you do this? How would you create a class where we allow free speech and inclusion to be somehow harmonized? And so what we've come up with in this course are really strategies that can increase the confidence with which faculty can handle different circumstances and the confidence with which they can feel, empowered to make those judgments. How do I handle this? How should I handle this? And also the ability to have the humility, I think, to say, I handled that badly last week. I'd like to address it this week so that we can move forward as a class, right? So it's not one strategy. It's not one, simple acronym that's going to solve every tension and conflict. And some conflicts and some disagreements aren't going to be resolved in a classroom, and maybe they shouldn't all be. But, on one hand, I think sometimes I talk about the need to have a special kind of tolerance for disagreement in an academic classroom, which is actually somewhat different from really most other spaces in which we speak with other people all the time. I need more tolerance for my academic setting for my classroom than I need for my children, or my parents, right? Or that stranger at the grocery store. It is really different, and it requires being reflexive and conscientious about that difference. And then the other thing that I think a lot about is the ability to acknowledge and be empathetic. I mean, this I'm taking right from your page, Terri. Regardless of the legal circumstances or my own personal feelings, you're telling me that something I said offended you or upset you. I might not see it that way, but I can still begin from a place of acknowledging that I'm sorry that you heard it that way, or I'm sorry that I said it that way, or I can express empathy regardless of the legality of whether that speech in question or whether the intention of the question. And so that doesn't mean I shouldn't be allowed to say it. It doesn't mean I won't say it again to somebody else, but it means that I can, be a little bit more amenable to a surprising or unexpected response from somebody else.
So we have a question, Mike. Anne is asking about the summer series. Is the registration an individual or institutional registration? Jonathan, you want to take that?
Sure. So right now this is our first time we're offering this course this summer, and we're doing it on an individual basis. If you're interested in institutional registration for numerous people, we encourage you to reach out to us, and we might be able to see if there are institutional deals. Penn America is also looking for colleges with which to partner to offer this to their faculty starting in the fall. So this program this summer is really open to faculty from numerous institutions, but we are thinking about ways to bring it to particular institutions starting in the fall. So if you're interested in any of that, you're welcome to reach out to us. I'll put my email in the chat here.
And while you're doing that, I think the other theme that's out there nowadays, I mentioned it briefly before around the Nicole Hannah-Jones, is that there is a perception, whether it's right or not, that certain topics may impact your ability to advance in your academic career, particularly, around some of the controversy that's emerging nowadays. So like if you're on a tenure track and your tenure is at risk by being more out there, perhaps, particularly in more conservative states, in the example of Nicole. Any perspective on that? It's another interesting place where it does feel like the scales have shifted to a certain extent, where higher ed, traditionally understood as maybe a little more liberal, left-leaning, many of the administrations are becoming more conservative, and then at the same time, the right is taking a claim to free speech, which is kind of Orwellian in some interesting ways. But putting that aside, any perspective on advice you might give to folks early in their academic career who are maybe seeking tenure or trying to understand how to navigate the complexity of the world we're in today? Any perspective, any advice you might want to give someone who's concerned about maybe poking the wrong bear nowadays?
Terri, you want to go first?
Actually, I'm going to let you go first.
Well, I'll say this. There is no course in academic freedom. I mean, just like we talk about, I often reflect upon the lack of a course in the First Amendment and free speech for students. And I have tremendous sympathy for the students who have arrived to campuses who don't understand free speech and have been caricatured in much media. But then when did we expect that they learned it? The same truths are there regarding professors in academic freedom. I got a PhD. I was an adjunct professor. I don't remember a single effort to educate me about my rights as a faculty member in terms of academic freedom and its traditions and why it even exists. It was always something that, you know, was I don't know, not relevant to me personally in my academic work, but it's fundamental. And so, you know, we have at Penn, I have personally counseled numerous faculty members who are dealing with difficult situations on their campuses, particularly when they feel they've been subject to censorship or are feeling like they would face repercussions for what they say and what they teach. We have developed an online campus free speech guide, which has some advice about, you know, what academic freedom is and what are different scenarios you might face as a professor. I'm putting the link to that in the chat here as well. And I think that it is a really unfortunate turn and how impoverished we all are if the people whose job it is to conduct research, to seek out truth, to speak that truth of findings, feel so afraid of what they might find and what they might say that, you know, the world never hears it. And so the key to this is to understand is that there are significant protections in place for academic freedom. It is important for faculty to play a role in challenging orthodoxies of all kinds, and that if you are facing a situation where your academic freedom is at stake, you know, we at Penn and other groups in the country, and groups, I will stress, groups across the political spectrum are ready to stand up for academic freedom, and they are doing it, and we are doing it with them all the time. So it's often just a matter of knowing the groups and the people who might be able to help you in a situation if you're facing it.
The other thing I would add to that is one of the things I get really concerned about is self-censorship, where faculty or students are so concerned about, you know, saying the wrong thing, or that they, you know, it's kind of what you're getting at, Jonathan, is that we create an atmosphere where faculty and students don't feel like they can say certain things or talk about certain things. And that's something we have to continually combat. It's really difficult because you don't know when somebody's not saying something.
Right.
And so that, yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just gonna say, that's why this training is so important. And actually there's the book, Jonathan and I actually got a copy of the book. It's a book to help students making the transition to college, but it actually has an excellent section on academic free speech and how students should be interacting in the classroom. And so, you know, there are lots of resources out there, and actually I'm going to encourage, you know, the institutions I work with to get this book for their students, because or at least, you know, highlight some of these things so that you know, it's something that you know, it's that they can latch on to and use as a tool to help them as they make their way into higher education.
It also seems, go ahead, Jonathan.
All I was going to say is the self-censorship issue, you know, it's so important to remember that it's happening everywhere. It doesn't happen to one side of the political spectrum. And I'm recalling the outpouring last summer of tweets and, you know, posts on Facebook about racism in higher education. And, you know, in the wake of many more conservative faculty saying they feel so censored, it was really quite, you know, eye-catching and kind of just incredible to see that there were so many stories that people had been holding in about racism on campuses that came out.
And Jonathan, do you remember the title of the book?
You're talking about one I recommended.
Yes, we were both like, yeah.
It's actually just over my shoulder, but I'll put it here.
I see it. Yes.
It's called How to College. I'll put a link to it here. It's by Lara Schwartz, who is one of the other facilitators of our program in the summer. Lara and I were fellows together at the University of California Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement a few years ago. And it's through that partnership that Lara and I and a third co-creator have made the sessions and co-facilitate them in the series for the summer.
I had a quick question for you, Terri. You know, the tumult around the Nicole Hannah-Jones story makes a ton of sense. I understand why it escalated to the point that it did. but I think in some ways it crowds out the conversation about folks like yourself who've been able to push boundaries and introduce new conversations and actually benefit from that conversation or benefit from that activity. So without spending, we don't have a lot of time, but it does seem like there are some positive lessons around having the courage to put yourself out there as well. And I don't know if you or Jonathan have any perspective. Like it almost feels like there's a service we should all be providing to not just highlight where there are these cautionary tales that are producing this chilling effect, but there are also examples where having that courage and putting yourself out there ultimately does lead to positive outcomes. And I know we're getting close to time, but maybe a little bit of perspective on that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, my perspective on that is, we do have opportunities to step in and step up. And that's part of the reason we're seeing the backlash, right? Is because people are stepping up and speaking out. And I think last summer was, with the protests after the murder of George Floyd, was kind of it's so funny. I hate to use the word reckoning because I don't think this country has gotten to a reckoning yet. It was an inflection point. So I prefer that instead of so when we look at these inflection points, they do tend to push things forward. So it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back type of situation. So I think we did move 2 steps forward. And then in the last few months, there's a interesting article out that shows the kind of the support for Black Lives Matter, went up this way and now it's on its way back down, and obviously some of this is partly why you're seeing this attack on critical race theory, because it's also an attempt to kind of tampen down the support for things like Black Lives Matter. So I think we have to be very sanguine and transparent about that. That's the dynamic. It's a very much political dynamic going on here, and so but I do think we are slowly but surely making progress, and we just have to figure out the best ways to approach this in terms of dealing with the backlash that inevitably happens in these situations. And Jonathan, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I was going to say it is a backlash, right? And that this is, I feel like it's like, 2 steps forward, 10 steps back. I mean, I said this before and I'll say it again. The wave of legislation and its potential to stifle conversations in schools so far outpaces schools, colleges, universities, professors, libraries. I mean, there's all sorts of bad legislation that's being introduced. It is so far outpaces what we might think of as the issues surrounding left-leaning professors being inhospitable to right-leaning students, which is how these issues have been characterized predominantly in more right-wing media. It's like they have taken the examples that they were given to create a much more significant monster or kind of a false a caricatured idea of critical race theory, and the backlash is extreme, and that's why it's so concerning.
Yeah, and that's part of why we need to be putting a more full perspective out there, because right now I think a straw man is generally the critical race theory as it's being presented by the right is a straw man that they're able to tear down. And because there's so little information getting out about these things in this outrage culture that you're talking about, it's almost like the responsibility of all of us, and particularly groups like PEN America, who are really leading some of these efforts to provide that fuller perspective, to really encourage more critical thought and more genuine discourse. We got about 2 minutes left, so final salvos. Any little morsels of goodness we want to impart to our listeners?
I'll just say it's nowhere more evident than in, I think it's Idaho, where the governor has created a commission that is going to root out Marxism, communism, socialism, critical race theory, and social justice in schools. It's some litany of boogeymen terms, and it's serious. It's a real commission. They're actually meeting to discuss how to do this, and that's where you really see just how what a caricature all of this has become. I think it's key to think about, okay, it's actually quite difficult to imagine, as you mentioned, Terri, how do we reckon with the past? You know, how do we have a truth and a national truth and reconciliation moment around a lot of these issues? And how do we do that for young people in schools? This is an extremely difficult thing to do. Unfortunately, one side of the current group of players at the table is so uncommitted to actually doing that in good faith. It makes it really difficult for the rest of us to do so and to collaborate to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and Christine made the comment about North Idaho College. I grew up in Spokane, which is right across the border there. So yeah, I know all about the Aryan nations and so on. So, but anyway, just a last comment in our last minute. I just think it's the work that Jonathan and Penn America and others are doing is so incredible and really helpful to faculty. And, you know, I mean, we're not doing this because, you know, I can tell you for sure, Jonathan and Brighter Higher Ed, we don't do this work because we're making any money off of it. We're doing it because it's really important work. And I hope that folks will sign up for the course because I can't imagine anything more important at this point in time in our political system. So, and actually, I'm going to see if I can talk Jonathan in doing a follow-up conversation and maybe even Mike on Clubhouse, because I have my Radical Empathy group on Clubhouse. So if you're not on Clubhouse, please follow us there, and we'll see if we can keep this conversation going.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Always great to get some of your time. Hopefully folks enjoyed the conversation. Terri, outstanding work as always. Thanks everyone for joining. This is This Week in Higher Ed.
Thanks so much.